So I'm taking a bit of a detour from the initial point, which is Paul's doctrine, Paul's philosophy, the gospel of Paul, because a couple of weeks ago, mentioning that post-destruction of Jerusalem, Paul's gospel became the gospel to amend, to build off of. Paul's gospel got left behind, actually, and what became of it transitioned after the destruction of Jerusalem. And the author of the book of Mark, the Gospels are written in a bit of a code language. And each and every single one of them has their own outlook and has their own particular school of thought. And beginning with the book of Mark puts forth a pretty sound introduction to where the reader, when understanding why their introduction is the way that it is, should know a little bit more about the context and about the landmark that they're particularly wanting to establish. And so you've got Mark 1 through 3, touched on this last time, but just highlighting it even further in this moment. Mark 1 through 3, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophets, behold, I send my messenger before thy face, which shall prepare thy way before thee. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. And so what this is doing, what this setup is doing, is that this setup is bringing us into the time period that the author is in. This setup is bringing us into the time period that the author is in, and also in which the quote-unquote gospel is now the gospel. Prior to this point in time, prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, it was just whatever it was. There were different sects, there were different beliefs, and the school of thought seems to have been divided into two classes. You have the class of Paul, or the philosophy of the gospel that Paul was preaching, and then you have the doctrine of another set of disciples, the initial movement, the initial Jesus movement and its philosophy, the initial movement, not taking it as far as to what Paul took it to, and Paul taking his understanding of their movement to a place where they wouldn't. And so you get to the book of Mark, and the first sentence is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now, this cannot be, none of this language, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, it can't take place without Paul. Because it is Paul who is putting forth the doctrine or the gospel of a consistent hope secured for you by the Logos. Now, the one that is the Son of God, this is God the Logos. This is not God the Father, in Paul's point of view. God the Logos is the one that humbled himself to fall into the existence of a human being for the sake of dying and rising for the sake of human being, and giving to that dying and rising human being now the clearness, the forgiveness, and the righteousness, so that anyone else joined to his priesthood can attain the same, just not for no reason at all, but so that they can attain the same to maintain a certain lifestyle, securing them for the day of redemption. This is Paul's philosophy here. And in this philosophy is the need for all of this to take place through a priesthood, presenting his blood to God the Father on behalf of God the Logos. The Christ of Paul has become the intercessor for humanity. And becoming the intercessor for humanity, he has become a faithful high priest that has suffered the infirmities of the ones that he is interceding for, making him a faithful high priest. This is Hebrews 2, this is Hebrews 4. This is Romans 8:34, who maketh intercession for us. So Paul has this philosophy that doesn't end with the crucifixion, doesn't end with the resurrection, and it doesn't even really end with an ascension. It ends with the consecration of his Christ as high priest for his new separated spiritual community to maintain the lifestyle that Eden failed to maintain and that host failed to maintain, and yet now with very excellent divine promises to do so. And so while it may seem like I may have forgotten about the initial point here of justification, of where this was originally going, with the point of the marriage between the conversation's conscience and the being of the human, that leading into Paul's gospel and understanding that, but then Paul's gospel and understanding that leading into the lifestyle that gospel advocated for, and then that advocate doing what that advocate does above or beyond this plane, leading into the book of Mark and the revelation of Paul's gospel being the concrete or the sure gospel after the destruction of Jerusalem. All of that plays into what one, in essence, must be justified from. But the core of that, I would say, is for the purpose of understanding why Paul's gospel became the one. Because it was Paul's gospel that got perverted by the Pauline type Jewish religious movement, new Jewish religious movements. And that perversion led into another perversion, and that perversion led into another perversion, and then 1 million perversions later, we have the proto-Christian religion, and then today, Christianity as it is. But at this point in time, there is a reason why the author of the book of Mark is beginning the beginning of gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. This is the beginning because the beginning is marked by what comes after it. And what comes after it is a prophecy of Elijah. And the prophecy of Elijah marks to the author and to the camp of the author and to the school of the author's thoughts what took place. Marks Paul's gospel as being the beginning when Elijah is manifested. And we saw last time that when Elijah is manifested, fire from heaven comes down. Remember in the book of Luke, when they went to Jerusalem and they weren't accepted, and then some of his disciples said, should we call down fire from heaven as did Elijah? So when Elijah is referenced, hate against the false prophets of God is manifested. And the author here is saying that the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ is taking place, and then he quotes the prophecy of Elijah, because the prophecy of Elijah has and is being fulfilled. The city and the sanctuary is being destroyed. The fulfillment of Elijah manifesting is here. This isn't a literal fulfillment. The author of the book of Mark, understanding this, is putting this into their manuscript because they're giving the reader, in essence, time and place. If you can have time and place, well, then you will be able to adjust yourself to understand what this narrative is truly about. If you can really understand what this narrative is truly about, then you can understand the movement that the author of the book of Mark is trying to engage the reader in. And so the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, laid down by Paul, and we can say that it was laid down by Paul by the vibration of what took place after the destruction of Jerusalem, with the temple no longer being a service. You now had two camps. You had the Christian camp, or the new Jewish religious movement, that camp. And then you had the camp of all of the other sects that relied on the temple religion. So you had two camps here, and you had to make a decision about what was what and about what wasn't what. Now, all of the camps failed that relied on the temple, except the camp of the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the only major sect that maintained themselves and that relied on a new type of understanding of their doctrine, and they became what we now today know as Rabbinic Judaism. That's what that is today, and it survived to destruct the temple because it was now you can bring the synagogue into your home, and it was a whole change to how things should be. The Christian camp, on the other hand, they didn't exist without the temple. They had Paul prior to this preaching his gospel, and his gospel pointing to the fact that the earthly temple is diminishing and the heavenly temple, due to the outcome of his gospel, is now more relevant. So the Christian camp, after the destruction of Jerusalem, they were not without the temple. They actually had the true form of the temple because of Paul. And it was this highlighted event, that destruction, that pointed their eyes heavenward. And so how did it point their eyes upward, heavenward? Well, it pointed their eyes heavenward because they saw the fulfillment of Elijah. Seeing the destruction of Jerusalem, the author of the book of Mark is letting us know that in the age that he is writing in and in the age of where his camp exists, Elijah has manifested, not literally. And we just have to remember that the time in history that we are in, there has been potential fulfillments of prophecy, and there has been a belief that prophecy has been fulfilled through those developments. An example being the Hasmonean dynasty. Now, the Hasmonean dynasty, the king priestly throne that was established there, these individuals lived through that, and if they didn't, it was recent history. Recent history. And with Herod coming in, that failure took place because they understood the book of Zechariah, he shall be a priest upon his throne. So when you see the Hasmoneans, or if you were alive back then and saw the Hasmoneans, you saw the kingdom of God and you believed that that was it. But when Herod came and that canceled, well, then that changed everything. So these people are seeing, and what I'm saying is that these people are seeing Scripture's reality fail to exist. They're seeing Scripture's reality fail to exist, and they're seeing everything that they thought to be true according to the Scriptures and according to the prophecies in a reality, in a real way, fail. And so what is the next thing to do except to do what Paul does? Paul doesn't just stick to reality. Paul takes reality and goes into that parallel universe. He takes the reality of the Scriptures and he goes with it into the realm of Greek interpretation, Greek philosophical interpretation, and he adds rhetoric to it. And doing so, he is coming out with a scheme. He's coming out with a scheme. He's coming out with a map. And his map, unlike the original or initial Jesus movement, doesn't end with simply a resurrection. Jesus movement, the original, didn't go to where Paul went, into a heavenly sanctuary, because that just it doesn't fit. And we've gone through, just quickly, we've gone through before, in the mythology that the initial Jesus movement had, there already exists a high priest next to their God above. There already exists. David, in a sense, and we've seen the Scriptures, actually prayed to another God, all capital G-O-D. And this God was the Lord, the capital L, all lowercase O-R-D, to the all capital L-O-R-D. The King James Version separates the deities of this Jewish mythology. There already exists a high priest in the temple above. So for the initial Jesus movement to have another high priest, or to believe that its leader is now the high priest, it doesn't make sense, because that doesn't mesh with the concrete structure that was already existing. But Paul doesn't care. Paul doesn't care. Paul rewrites the Jewish mythology, and he inserts his invented Jesus at the right hand of the Father and the Logos of Hellenistic Judaism. So Paul's creating and is moving away from the initial Jesus movement, and this moving away is giving him a lot of hate from the people that are around him, and rightfully so, because you are diminishing what's down below for something that is above, and God wouldn't do that. And yet Paul is moving with the age. Paul's moving with the age, and Paul is saying, yes, God has done that. And not only has he done it, the hate that you are giving me, you will see. You will see that wrath is coming to you for not acknowledging the kingdom that I am preaching, for not acknowledging the priesthood that you must be joined to in order to receive the forgiveness of sins that Moses can't give you, in order to receive the righteousness that Moses can't give you, and in order to receive the reconciliation, to maintain that righteousness and forgiveness for the day of redemption and the day of resurrection that Moses cannot give you. So Paul's already putting forward a philosophy here, or a gospel of a hope fulfilled in the temple above. When the destruction of Jerusalem hits and there's no temple, what do? All of the temple religions failed. Only one that maintained themselves was the Pharisees, which transformed themselves into what we know today as Rabbinic Judaism. Christianity, on the other hand, had Paul. And Paul set up the framework. And from that framework, it was built on. Now, it was built on, Paul's framework was built on because the destruction of Jerusalem pointed to a reality that needed to be accepted. Elijah manifested not literally, but figuratively, in the form of Rome. The next thing that should take place is the manifestation of that figure at the right hand of the majesty above, as it says in the book of Hebrews, chapter 8, 1 and 2. And just going to the book of Mark 13, 14 to 19, and just keeping in mind that all of this is written while and after the destruction of Jerusalem is taking place in the book of Mark. So even though Mark is writing in the book of 13 of his main character talking about the things that will take place in the tribulation that will take place, the author of the book of Mark has already lived this, so he's writing it. This isn't something in real time. The author of the book of Mark is simply giving critical narrative here. He's giving critical narrative about what has already taken place. And it's for a specific reason that I'm pointing this out. Mark 13, 14 to 19. Mark 13, 14 to 19. But when you shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing where it ought not, let him that readeth understand, let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains. So the author of the book of Mark already understands that what's taking place in their time and what is concluding, this is the revelation of the abomination of desolation. Immediately, whoever is reading this and whoever should go back to the book of Daniel chapter 9. And the book of Daniel chapter 9 and even chapter 8, because chapter 8 kind of, takes this figure into consideration. But 9 talks about the destruction of the city and the sanctuary. This figure standing where it ought not. And at this point in time, the author of the book of Mark acknowledges and understands that this is Rome. This is Rome, and this is actually happening. And so, still in the book of Mark 13, we just read verse 14, jumping down to verse 19, in those days shall be affliction such as was not from the beginning of the creation which God created until this time, neither shall be. Jumping down to verse 24. But in those days after that tribulation, the sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars of heaven shall fall, and the powers that are in heaven shall be shaken, and then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. Now, this is not a literal manifestation. This is something to take place after the sun, moon, and the stars are fallen. And this is all figurative language. The sun and the moon and the stars, they are representing what is fallen at that point in time. The temple, the people, and the philosophy, they all represent the sun, the moon, and the stars of the Jews' religion. The the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem and the city itself also is representing these things fallen. This is the world, the quote-unquote world that is fallen. And in the Bible, the world does not mean literal natural world. This is the world of religion. The world of religion is falling at this time. And it is taking place by the one standing where it ought not. Now, when this takes place, this is the manifestation of Elijah. This is the manifestation of Elijah. When Elijah manifests, this tribulation, this affliction, it is what is to manifest. The next thing that should take place is the revelation of that prophet, of that son. And it does. That manifestation takes place in the form of an idea. A form of an idea that Paul has laid down. And what Paul has laid down is the consecration of his Christ at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Elijah manifesting prepares the way for this revelation to be accepted as true. And hereafter, after the destruction of Jerusalem, now you have the official son of the Majesty on high, anointed and consecrated and in the position that he is in, because of the foundation that Paul has laid and because of the direct revelation that the destruction of Jerusalem has given to this persuasion. So now there is nothing that can be compared to this. There is nothing that should be held into the same context, into the same rank as this gospel that Paul has given, because, well, now this must be true. The temple is gone, and yet one must still remain for us to honor. What is the Sabbath of the Bible? This is a question I get all the time. And so often that I decided to write a book about it. And in this book, you, the reader, will understand in context what this term means, and also the intention behind the Creator developing and instituting this period of time, or this appointment. The Sabbath is about rest, but what is rest? This book explains it. Rest is a concept. Rest is a concept. It's not what we think in our Western thought. Rest is a concept. And this book digs into that concept for the individual serious about their faith's growth and development. So check out my website and check out the book, The Bible Sabbath, to understand how to better vibe your conversation with the living God's course of growth and development. And so talking about these, this manifestation of Elijah and this manifestation of that son, this isn't literal. This isn't literal, and the author of the book of Mark and the camp then alive did not take that to be a literal manifestation. They looked at it in the way that it ought to be looked at. They saw that the manifestation of Elijah was Rome. The one that stands where it ought not, that was Rome. The one is standing where it ought not because that's Elijah working. When Elijah is finished working, then the manifestation of that son should take place. And I'm saying all of this because there's an illustration here of vision and revelation. And just quickly going to the book of Mark, looking at how the Bible, or should I say the author of the book of Mark, talks about revelation. How the author of the book of Mark talks about revelation. You see Mark 6:14. Mark 6:14. Mark 6:14. And King Herod heard of him, for his name was spread abroad, and he said that John the Baptist was risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works to show forth themselves in him. Now, John the Baptist was not literally risen from the dead. There was not a figure, John the Baptist, walking around, doing things. The figure of Jesus did not take on the personage of John. So now you have the appearance of John walking around doing something. Jesus doesn't exist except on the inside of this new personage. The aspect of resurrection to the author of the book of Mark is not literal. John was not literally resurrected. John was resurrected by spirit. John was resurrected in character. John manifested by character. And this is going to continue and does continue by the time you get to that resurrection on that third day. It isn't literal. This is a continuing frame of reference. And this continuing frame of reference is how the world at that time understood what was taking place to them and their part in it. So when they saw the destruction of Jerusalem, they saw Elijah. After seeing Elijah, they understood that next that son should be revealed. And he was. Wasn't revealed literally, he was revealed in character. The destruction of the temple meant the temple service no longer existing, meant that whoever should honor this and whatever this stood for, that was false. That was not the way God wanted it. If he wanted it, it would remain, and it would be built up efficiently to where it should not be heard anymore. But it's done. Where do they go from now? It's not our problem. Or maybe it is, because they can come to our camp, and in our camp, we honor the actual temple from which that temple supposedly is supposed to be drawn from. Now, this is the thought process of the movement at that time after the destruction of Jerusalem. Temple's gone, and yet the true remains. While Paul was alive, Paul was preaching the kingdom of God. Paul was preaching wrath to the individuals that would not hear or honor the kingdom of God. Paul already talked about his Christ at that right hand. Paul was rewriting while he was alive the epic of Israel. He was rewriting it. And now when the epic of Israel came to its conclusion, it came to its conclusion only for the sects that relied on the temple religion. And of course, the Pharisee religion, escaped and became its own, which today exists as, again, Rabbinic Judaism. But the Christian movement maintaining its position that Paul already established, its position of the temple above, where Christ sitteth on the right hand of God, Colossians 3, solidified from Colossians 2. This is where one needs to now be, because with the temple rites gone, with the temple religion gone, purity and attaining it can only come from that temple above. So I can only imagine that at this point in time, the minds then existing saw Paul and went, you know what? He was talking all this and there was a division, but you know what? This is it now. And from there, it was Paul's gospel and its frame that got picked apart and got further perverted and got built upon to where now the understanding of Jesus, the Son of God, has changed and has left where Paul envisioned it.